Good morning and welcome to the 9th meeting in 2013 of the Health and Sport Committee. As usual, can I remind all of those present, members and the public, to turn off any mobile phones, Blackberries and other wireless devices, as they can often interfere with the sound system. Our first item on the agenda today is to consider 3 negative Scottish statutory instruments. The first is SSI 2013-70, National Health Service Superannuation Scheme and Pension Scheme Scotland Amendment Regulations 2013. There have been no motions to annul. The Subordinate Legislation Committee has not drawn the instrument to the Parliament's attention. Are there any comments from the members? One comment, yes, Richard?
One comment. I mean, this has all been debated and discussed, and therefore, coming in, these are substantial increases, of course, in the pension contributions that are not absolutely necessary for the purposes of the maintaining the NHS scheme. It is actually about deficit reduction, and I just want to put that on the record, that this is the UK government insisting on this money towards deficit reduction. And I also want to add one further note, and that is I feel that it's an unreasonable burden on individuals who are part-time. Because if you're a part-time worker earning over £21,176 up to £26,557 at full-time rates, but you're earning at half-time, you're going to have a further increase in your pension contribution of 0.3% this year. Whereas somebody who is on £15,000 but is earning that as a full-time income will have no increase. And it seems to me that there has been a degree of unfairness in this, which affects particularly women. And I think that this is a fairly discriminatory measure which has not been taken into account in terms of equalities. However, this is not to blame the Scottish Government, although they do have the powers. They would have been punished to change what has been proposed by the UK government. But I just want to put it on the record that I think that that using pension funds for deficit reduction is yet another illustration of the fact that we have suffered because of the banking crisis, that they have caused this extraordinary situation that we're in at the present time, but the consequences are being paid for by everyone, including people who are earning less than the national average income.
Any other member? Annette?
I think it's become a little bit political to just say it wasn't entirely the banking crisis. The previous government had a degree of guilt in this.
Other members? There are no other comments, then I will put the question, which is SSI 2013-70, previously referred to and laid out before you. Are we all agreed? Thank you. The second SSI is SSI 2013-83, Food Miscellaneous Amendment and Revocation Scotland Regulations 2013. Again, there have been no motions to annul, and the Subordinate Legislation Committee has not drawn the instrument to the Parliament's attention. Are there any comments from the members? No comment. Then I will put the question, which is on SSI 2013-83, laid out before you and previously referred to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. The third and final SSI this morning is SSI 2013-84, Food Safety Sampling Qualifications Scotland Regulations 2013. Once again, there have been no motions to annul, and the Subordinate Legislation Committee has not drawn the instrument to the Parliament's attention. Are there any comments from members? If there's no comments, I'll put the question, which is SSI 2013-84, previously referred to and laid out before you. Are we all agreed? Thank you. We now move to agenda item number 2. Which is a one-off evidence session on the Scottish Strategy for Autism. I would like to welcome this morning Richard Ibbotson, National Director of Scotland Autism Initiatives. Alan Somerville, Chief Executive, Scottish Autism, and Dr. Robert Moffat, National Director, Scottish National Autistic Society, Scotland. Welcome to you all this morning. I'll go directly to Martin MacDonald for our first question and then take bids.
Thank you very much, Convener, and members will be aware of my own personal interest in the subject of autism. Can I ask the panel how they feel the existence of the autism strategy has influenced or affected the way that services are being delivered at a local level? Do they feel that there is percolation of the aims of the strategy into local service delivery at either local authority or health board level?
Could I?
Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah. I think it's potentially too early to actually be able to concretely say that there has been definite measurable effects percolating through. I think there's no doubt that there's a lot of positive has come from the strategy. We obviously have the commitment from the government to implement the strategy. We have the funding. We have the implementation of one-stop shops. Importantly, we have the mapping exercise of local services and service delivery, which is ongoing at the moment. And we're at a stage where the data has been gathered for that exercise and is about to be analysed. I think once we're at a point in a couple of months' time where that data begins to present a picture, we would be able to answer that question a lot more fully. Of course, also, there is the proposed implementation of autism coordinators, which has been mooted, will be rolled out across the country. And I think, once again, it's only once they come into being that we'll actually be able to sort of make some kind of concrete judgment on that. So really all the pieces are there or thereabouts, and we're at a point where we're kind of ready to press the go button. On a general level, in terms of making a difference at a local level, well, certainly the Development Fund has funded a raft of initiatives at local level throughout Scotland, and certainly feedback that we're getting is that these initiatives are having the desired effect at a local level. But in terms of a national picture, I would have to say, in my opinion, it's a bit too early yet because of the factors I've already described.
I would tend to agree with Robert. I think it's slightly too early. I'm pretty upbeat about it. I think it's so far has been a good combination of strategic project work and thinking about the future, and particularly, well, Robert's mentioned the raft of measures that are there, but also for the future there's a database and screening project underway to be able to identify people earlier and review ways that we can identify autism earlier. There's a project which my organisation championed, which is called microsegmentation, and that's being run jointly by Professor Tommy Mackay at Strathclyde University and Professor Martin Knapp of the London School of Economics. And we think that's one of the most important projects that's around. What it will do is identify the escapable costs of autism. So what you have to remember is that autism rarely occurs alone. It occurs with a whole plethora of comorbid conditions. No one has ever actually mapped the concentrations in the populations and the demographics of those comorbid conditions, but it's that which defines the individual and why a personalised agenda is so important. So in actual fact, in about 18 months when that project is delivered, we expect to have some kind of a map of the populations with these comorbid conditions. Professor Mackay will look at life trajectories with and without appropriate intervention, and Professor Knapp, who did the major study for the National Audit Office in England, which identified the total costs of autism, will do a lot of clever statistics and come up, hopefully, with what the escapable costs are. So that, for the first time, the Minister here will have a logical decision-making base, an understanding of what works and what doesn't, and what will produce the quickest return. So I think, in actual fact, with these strategic projects that are going on, Robert also mentioned the mapping project, there's a lot of groundwork which has been done, And from a position where Scotland was probably last of the home nations 3 years ago, I think we're in the lead. And in actual fact, we could be world leaders in 5 years' time with this sort of work that's actually going on. I'm very excited about it. With I will say one negative thing, though, because, well, again, the strategy itself, one of the most important things, I think, in here was that a recognition that we had to do something for the quality of life of people with autism and not just maintain a physiological survival. So those are fine words, but it is, I regret to say, being undermined at the point of delivery in local authorities. No one can deny, obviously, the financial constraints they're under, but local authorities are now setting maximum prices per hour for service delivery, which precludes the kind of specialist help that people with autism needs. And in my humble opinion, in that direction lies the Staffordshire Health Board. Care given by minimum wage support workers without the training and education to deliver what they need to do. So the picture is good and bad. At the high level, the words are fine. There's a lot of strategic work being done, but it's being undermined at the point of delivery by cost cutting.
Yep.
Echo what my colleagues have said. I think the way that the money that's been attached to the strategy has been used is good, in that there are a number of really good, very local initiatives, and that's great if you happen to be somebody that's going to benefit from that particular project. But then there are also the national developments like the mapping project, the rollout of the one-stop shops, some of the research that's going on, that possibly it's too early to say whether they've had a specific local impact, but are more likely to do that in the long term. So the balance is positive.
If I may, I would just like to add that another positive aspect of the developments over the last year has been the partnership working, which has evolved between the government, COSLA, and the 3 autism organisations. That's been a positive step forward. Of course, guided and aided by the reference group. I would put forward the point that the implementation of the strategy at a local level, I mean, we're talking about a national autism strategy, but really it's the implementation of the strategy at a local level which is going to be key to answering the question of what effect does it have at a local level. And really we're in what you might call a pre-implementation phase. It's just over a year since the strategy was launched. There's been a lot of preparatory work done, and as I say, all the pieces are there and it's really ready to go. But the key really is making sure that for example, all local authorities fully embrace the idea of developing autism strategies and implementing those strategies. So that we have a joined up picture from national level right down to local level. Of course, there are difficulties at the current moment in time in the implementation of this local action related to the fact that many local authorities are quite understandably not willing to start developing local strategies at this moment in time, because it makes more sense to wait until the mapping project reports and actually gives the kind of national picture on services. So there are some things that we need to take into consideration, but one thing we need to keep our eye on is this notion that as the next year evolves, we need local authorities to fully embrace the strategy and actually bring about change at a local level.
Mark?
We know that other members want to come in, but if I could maybe just ask one further question. One of the issues that has often been raised with me at events, and I was recently at an autism conference in Aberdeenshire where the same issue was raised with me, is around the transition between children's and adult services. And there is a feeling that at a local level, autism is very much viewed as an early years priority, but less so at an adult services level. Do you believe that the strategy will help to change that perception, or do you think that there's more work needs to be done beyond the strategy to ensure that adults with autism or children who are becoming adults with autism can be sure that the pathway and the continuation of care and support will be there?
I think, remember that the strategy has 2-year, 5-year and 10-year goals. The 10-year ones, not surprisingly, are the really, really hard ones. Wherever you run into, I mean, one of the things about autism, which is it's very complex, it's multidimensional, it interfaces with many different parts of the state. So education tends to look at the education of a child. If you're in the NHS, you tend to look at the mental health of an individual, and so on. So individuals passing between different organs of the state always encounter difficulty, because they're crossing walls, they're crossing budgets, they're crossing responsibilities. This administration is looking at integration of health and social care, and this is part of that picture, and I think it's a much longer term. What we're looking at in the reference group at the moment is ways that we can think of, we're looking at the ways our work streams at the present moment don't join up. We're looking for the gaps which we will need to fill in order to deliver the goals. And that kind of smooth transition, first of all within a person's lifetime, and later on between different organs of the state or different services of the state. These are the hard ones. And part of the reason we said that we would have 10-year goals for the harder things is that you just cannot do that sort of thing overnight. And it's going to need sustained pressure, it's going to need sustained support from this Parliament. And actually it's quite daunting. It's a gigantic amount of work to try and get that to go. But the prize would be enormous, because there is misery among people who get to 18 and suddenly they're out on the street. And I think one of the differences is whether you have autism or not, you have a right to education. You don't have a right to support services as an adult. So you cross a critical Rubicon there when you become an adult. And it's these are the complex things we need the state to recognise the individual, and not the dimension of them that interfaces with that particular function of the state. That's hard.
I would add that the mechanism is certainly there in the strategy, or there is a mechanism within the strategy to ensure we have good and effective transition. It's actually recommendation 18. It's recommended that good practice transition guidance is developed, building on from existing educational guidance, etc., etc. So the mechanism is there, but what we need to be really careful about is that once again, this is embraced wholeheartedly and rolled out across the country, and that we don't end up with what we have at the moment, which is the oft-quoted postcode lottery. It must be good transition from school into other life opportunities, must be consistent across the country. I can tell you, I was speaking to colleagues in the National Statistics Society who support people into employment yesterday, and they were telling me that one of the groups that they are really concerned about is young people with autism aged between 16 and 25, that without proper transition guidance and without the willingness of employers to actually understand autism and provide employment opportunities for this age group, in my colleague's opinion, we're actually risking a kind of lost generation where this group of 16 to 25-year-olds will quickly become 40-year-olds who have never worked. So this is where good transition guidance is absolutely essential. And as I say, the mechanism is there, but we need to keep our eye on the ball and make sure that it's consistent across the country.
I would agree with what Robert said there, that transitions are always going to be a difficult stage of somebody's life, particularly the transition from education, childhood into adulthood and the world of work. And if those options aren't there for something to transition into, that's when challenges inevitably will occur. I think where the mapping project will help us with this is I would anticipate, without predicting what's going to come up, that transitions will be one of the key themes that comes out of that, and how autism coordination could look at addressing some of those issues.
So I'm aware I'm doing the Colombo thing of just one more thing, but can I, obviously there is the Countess In report that NAS have launched, and cheap plug, I'm going to be leading a members' debate on that this evening, but that also looks at what I would call the next stage, which is employment. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that while local services at the authority and health board level have a role to play, private sector employers have a role to play as well in ensuring that those with autism who wish to gain and sustain employment are able to do so. So, as well as the aims of the strategy, do you feel that there is enough interest being generated outside of the public sector around issues with autism and ensuring that we can have, for example, autism-friendly workplaces and workplace environments?
I'm sure my colleagues would agree with me that that for all the virtues of the strategy and for all the good work in this pre-implementation phase that I've spoken about, the issue of employment is one of the weaknesses of the strategy. It's weak specifically because it's covered by only one recommendation. The wording of the recommendation is, in my opinion, completely inappropriate for people with autism. Supported employment frameworks are not an appropriate way of guiding people with autism into work. So recommendation 26 really, in my opinion, needs to be revisited, as it's the only mechanism within the strategy that addresses employment, and it's not really fit for purpose. Once again, I'll go back to speaking to my colleagues and prospects in the Supported Employment Service. They were telling me that there are 3 key cohorts that need to be given consideration. There are people with autism who are graduates. There are people with autism 25 plus who are not graduates, and there's the original cohort I spoke about, 16 to 25. Now they're having great success in actually placing graduates within blue chip and corporate work environments. In fact, demand is far outstripping supply, and we don't have the capacity to get everybody that we want to get through these programs. So the actual graduate side of employment is a hopeful scenario, bar the issues around resources. But for the plus 25s who don't have a degree and the 16 to 25s, we're in a real danger of these people never working unless we actually do something to more firmly focus the national strategy on the employment needs of autism, people with autism.
Can I just say there's another work stream going on that this government has funded, which is the Scottish Autism Network, and they have a working group. We all sit on it, and they have a working group looking at employability, and a lot of the issues Robert just mentioned were discussed last week. So the problem is well understood. Sorting it's easy, it's hard.
I chair the reference group subgroup on employment, and there's a real, although there is only one recommendation that mentions employment, and it's a fairly weak recommendation, there's a really good momentum and group of people that are working on trying to instill and develop other aspects of the strategy which might not be overtly talking about autism, but are talking about people's progress and development and skills. It's really difficult to engage with employers as a group, and it's not helped, I think, sometimes by the media coverage that autism still gets, and where typically in the media people with autism are referred to as suffering from autism, or it's often seen as a childhood disorder, not an adult disorder. So it's very hard for us and indeed for the strategy to influence media coverage and the view of people with autism in the community. But that's an important strand that we need to address and tackle.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why the report count us in. National Autistic Society Scotland actually went out and asked people with autism across the country what would make a real difference in your lives, and employment was one of the biggies. Everyone wants a job. Basically, they're no different from you or I. And that's why there's a recommendation in the Count Us In report that we should really be looking at an employment champion to address the sort of problems that Richard's just spoken about, employer perceptions in terms of employing people with autism. In many ways, they make most fabulous employees, yet because of a lack of awareness of those benefits amongst employers, as I say, we're really risking these people disappearing into a black hole. Yeah.
It's shifting the emphasis from the perception of it being a problem that needs to be solved to actually looking at people with autism as having something positive and a positive contribution to offer Scotland.
Thanks, Mark. Bob Doris.
Thanks, Convener. It's a slight degree of trepidation to ask this question because, and can I maybe give a context to it? What's in my head at the moment was some service reform that's taking place in Glasgow in terms of people with learning disabilities as a specific group. And I don't want to dig into the politics around that. I genuinely don't. I take a very specific view, and that's been made public within the region that I represent. But one of the issues with the change of service is the feeling that those with learning disabilities were not appropriately consulted in shaping the services that exist for them. And it's that idea of there being a community, but individual aspirations and getting that balance right as well. At the start you mentioned that some people with autism will have a degree of multimorbidity, so perhaps there'll be a cohort out there whose autism or other morbidities that they have to live with will have a more profound impact on them as an individual and their family and carers. We live in a world of rolling out self-directed support in terms of how all people with additional support needs and care needs are going to be better supported but empowered to decide to shape how they want their lives to progress within the community. For those with more profound impact on their lives, what work is there within the strategy, or how has it been taken forward to make sure that individuals and their families are shaping the services and supports that are out there, I suppose, in the principles of self-directed support? And the reason there's a degree of trepidation in relation to that is I'm not sure what is out there, or even if the terminology I use to ask the question is appropriate. But I have met a number of constituents who have autism, but that's not actually the biggest barrier in their lives. It's other underlying issues they have. But are they still a central part of the National Autism Strategy?
I think the way we've tackled this, it does contain phrases like services appropriate to their specific needs. There is a commitment to personalisation, and I think personalisation is more important in autism than almost any other field because of the sheer bewildering complexity. You are really dealing with a map of the world which is the size of the world because everybody is different. And the more you're able to deconstruct, if you like, a person's autism and understand the various components go there, the better you are able to design services. I see the greater danger being in frameworks being offered to people which they just don't fit. So really accepting and embracing a personalisation and agenda for each individual is the key to getting around that problem.
When I first started working in the world of autism 10 years ago, we actually had a scenario where many local authorities across Scotland had local autism steering groups that were populated by a wide range of interested parties, professionals, parents, people with autism. And the purpose of these groups was largely to look at local provision and, was local provision meeting local need? Making sure that the professionals were fully clued up in terms of the views and the needs of people with autism. And somehow, don't ask me why, but over the course of a few years, practically every one of these groups just evaporated and disappeared. And I can only think of one at the moment, one local authority that kind of regularly holds such groups. So once again, there's, I think, in answer to your question, there's this implication that it is a fair amount to do with how things are actually carried out at a local level. So if we eventually have local autism strategies, then we would fully expect that that people with autism, regardless of the challenges that they face, regardless of what comorbidities they experience, regardless of what their needs are, that they would be invited to be a part of that process and be full members of that process and guide local service provision. So to me, that would be one way that we could ensure that that happens. All too often, in our haste to do the right thing, we tend to do things for people without asking whether it's the right thing, And really, we need to have a kind of mindset that we need to go out and actually ask people and get them involved in the decision-making process.
I think when you work with people with autism, in a way, personalisation and the drive towards personalisation of services is not something that's alien to us in autism services, because people with autism are so unique, so different from each other, that they've always demand a personalised and individualised approach. Just as an aside, we are involved, the three organisations here involved in a small project that is funded through the Self-Directed Support Fund, where we're developing a range of information and resources that are designed to support people on the spectrum going through the SDS process.
Yeah. I suppose that's kind of what I'm keen to find out, and I'm speaking more in general terms because I don't know enough about it in terms of fitting into a framework, or can you have a framework which adapts to the hopes, needs and aspirations of those with autism and their families, and those with more profound comorbidity challenges, to have almost like a bespoke support for them. So would you see self-directed support, for example, if there's a local autism framework and there's a number of recommended services that are out there for individuals, if the individual decided actually that's not an appropriate service for myself, can I direct the resource, and perhaps I want to use that resource to support me in further education college, or to support me in employment, or support me for whatever reason? Is that something that should be happening as a matter of course under the principles of self-directed support?
Yeah, I think the principles behind self-directed support fit with autism so well because of the individuality of it. I think that our concern behind it all is that sometimes, very often, the needs of people with autism are not easily identified. It's sometimes really quite complex to really pick up what somebody is supporting their needs are. So.
I think you can have the trap, though. I mean, Glasgow, we mentioned earlier, Glasgow's first pass at self-directed support excluded people with autism who did not have a learning disability. So high-functioning people with Asperger's that Robert's been talking about, who are employable, get no support at all under that scenario. So that's why, again, I keep coming back to the goals. The goals are very woolly, big, overarching, but they allow you to look at what's right for the individual rather than thinking about fitting them into a framework. Now, that is, again, difficult from a local government perspective, because you've got to design services which are fair, accessible, understood by people. But it's the sheer complexity of how you need a degree of flexibility, you need a degree of personalisation before you can do that. And the only message I want to leave here is that you cannot have a rigid framework because people will fall between two stools.
Just very, very briefly, Convener, I have to say I won't be drawn on Glasgow. Needless to say, I've got almost no positive words to say in terms of how self-directed support's been implemented and imposed in some circumstances in Glasgow, which seems to go against the principles, but I'll leave that sitting. I'm more concerned looking at how the National Autism Strategy is rolling out across the country in every local authority area. And I suppose I think I know the answer to this, but it's just to put it on the record, I suppose. If a local authority, in conjunction with the Health Board and other partners, are bringing a local autism strategy, is the first thing they should do is speak to those with autism and their families to find out what their hopes, needs and desires are before they start to do a draft framework for it. And is that happening across the country, I suppose, is what I would ask.
I think where we are at the moment is, going back again to what Robert said, is that the mapping exercise. I think the place we start is what is actually happening out there. And then we really need to think about where the gaps are, and we need to think about putting them in the context of the goals. But there is no business in this world where you succeed if you don't listen to your customers. So it's a fundamental, basic thing to do.
I think some of my questions probably have been answered. It really was around the support, just post-diagnosis, the support that's given to families and individuals with autism. I mean, it would appear that that's patchy across the country and not yet adequate across the country. Would that be fair? Fair comment.
I think what I like to use is with the health service. If you go to your doctor and say, I'm having pains in my chest, from the point where he thinks you may have cardiac problems, he'll send you to a consultant, you'll have all the tests done, you'll get a letter through the door, say we'd like you to attend at such a hospital such a day, you'll get processed and you're out in the street, eventually, hopefully cured. If If you have a diagnosis of autism, you've got a diagnosis of autism, and there's nothing. You've then got to go and find an assessment. You've got to the local authority has got to provide funding. Then there are all sorts of discontinuities. It just doesn't happen. And I've often said, when I look at the parents of the children in our school, they are determined individuals. They have fought and clawed and got their way through the barriers to get to where they are and had their child placed in an autism-specific school. There are no mice that get through it. And that's a measure, really, of how hard it is the state doesn't do it automatically.
I remember when I first became an MSP almost 10 years ago, going to a local meeting up in Aberdeenshire, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the parents there were extremely determined and working very, very hard to get what they felt their children actually needed. And I have to say, I haven't heard so much from them in recent years. So whether that's a sign of things having improved, I suspect it might be, because otherwise I think we'll probably still be hearing. But I mean, we have had some representations, and I think there was a presentation, not that I'm a member of the Human Rights Cross-Party Group, but there was a presentation made there by people from Autism Rights, and they appear to be really quite, from a sort of brief reading of what the presentation was, they don't seem to be happy at all, particularly about autistic people with autism being included within the Mental Health Act.
I think there's a particular issue for the able adult with particularly late diagnosis. Diagnosis in adulthood is often leads to avoid to nothing. There are, however, I mean, they mentioned the kind of one-stop shop initiatives where they're happening and where they've happened so far. There is at least something that becomes then almost a kind of post-diagnostic referral acts point of information and advice that even though sometimes it's difficult to provide and signpost on, if there's nothing to signpost on to, but at least there's a point of contact there.
I would like to add that one of the positive aspects that's come out of the strategy is the recognition that we need to look into the capacity to diagnose adults, because there's a huge numbers of undiagnosed adults out there, many of whom will be struggling. So it is positive that there's been a project set up under Ian McClure to actually look at that. But I would offer a note of caution. We could easily fall into a trap where we actually address the problem of diagnosis, but then at the point of post-diagnostic support, nothing happens, and that is practically, that's a nightmare scenario for people. And when we went out and spoke to people for the Count Us In report, that, funnily enough, was one or the other. There was four basic things that they came back and said that this is what we want. Employment I've already spoken about. This was also one that they said this would make a difference to our lives. We want the ability to be able to be diagnosed, because that will make a tremendous difference in our lives. But more importantly, we want a post-diagnostic pathway to be developed. Now, Alan spoke about, I believe it was a heart condition. That's a medical condition. We can easily construct post-diagnostic pathways for people that have these conditions. Why not for people with autism? The danger is we just diagnose them and then they fall into this black hole. So once again, what we've recommended is that post-diagnostic, increase capacity to diagnose, develop consistent post-diagnostic care pathways that are applicable across Scotland, and we apply a heat target to absolutely make sure that everybody who needs it gets access to it.
Is there anything like a signed guideline for autism? In the health service, there's signed guidelines for different conditions. Is there anything like that for autism? It strikes me that something like that might lay down guidance for how to proceed after diagnosis.
Yes, well, I mean, it already exists, and once again, there is some work looking at the relevance of that for people with autism, because there are some questions surrounding it. But really what's needed is as Richard said, it's all very well diagnosing people, but then if you don't have anywhere to point them to in order to actually complete that path to leading a fulfilled and meaningful life, and being able to cope with their condition, then I'm afraid you're doing people a great disservice. So this is why we need to not only increase the capacity to diagnose, but we also need to develop good, solid post-diagnostic care pathways, and we must measure, we believe, you know, in order to prove that people are actually getting access to this.
Eileen?
And I think, like my colleague Nanette Mel, I think a lot of the questions I was wanting to ask, I think I've already been answered. But I wanted to come back to a point that Dr. Moffat had mentioned earlier, when you talked about the partnership working with the Scottish Government and COSLA, which you saw as being a positive step forward that was guided and aided by the reference group. I mean, how's that partnership actually kind of working in practice at the moment?
Well, in practical terms, we meet regularly as a partnership, primarily to oversee the 3 projects that were jointly amongst the 5 of us responsible for, which is the implementation of the one-stop shops, the mapping project, and the self-directed support project that Richard mentioned. So we meet monthly in order to sort of push that forward. And you know, it's working very successfully at the moment.
That's the good side of it. The last of the 2-year recommendations is about adherence to existing commissioning guidelines by COSLA, and I think when the mapping project reports, that's when we'll see it. The arguments will be out in the open then. I think it's a secure seg, it's good in parts. And some people embrace the philosophy entirely. Others pursue a cost-cutting agenda, which is at odds with what the words in this strategy. So I think the mapping exercise will shine a bright light on where commissioning guidelines are being followed and where they're not.
And obviously, we talked a lot about, you know, how we can ensure there's support for families and individuals in terms of the post-diagnostic support, but also I was just wondering in terms of the support that's given for families in actually getting the diagnosis in the first place.
Well, the best place most children with autism is when they encounter the education system, and one of the other projects which the government has entrusted my organisation with is revamping the autism toolbox for schools, which is an important measure to, I mean, all 3 of our organisations spend a lot of time lobbying for general education on autism among health and social care and education practitioners to be improved. I think that was a useful tool. You'll get a lot of bang for that buck. But we've all got an enormous amount of work to do. I've attended conferences about police work. There are projects going on. All 3 of our organisations have put out alert cards for policemen to understand what they're dealing with. But really, it's a gigantic task because you're asking people who are already doing busy and difficult jobs to absorb a whole new ethos of the way of looking at people and trying to understand why they do what they do. But I think it's a kind of a large-scale marketing effort. The more we do this and the more we progress with these goals, the more professionals will understand what we're trying to do.
I think the point has been made previously many times. There's no denying that I think we've made giant strides in terms of the diagnosis of children. I can't remember the exact figures off the top of my head, but it's something in the region of we've diagnosed 7,000 children, and we would expect there to be 8,000 there, you know, 8,000 or 9,000. The real challenge remains, and that is that epidemiologically you'd expect 42,000 adults out there, and we've only managed to diagnose 2,700. So that is the big challenge. It's not so much about supporting parents to get a diagnosis for their children, although there still are problems around that. It's really this whole issue of this whole hidden population of adults that, you know, not all of them will need support, but when you're talking about, you know, 40,000 invisible people, then if there's 20,000 of them struggling desperately, then that is a big problem for the country. In terms of children, as I say, the picture is much better, much better. But still, you know, without seeming to be too negative, I mean, we still come across parents who come to us and say, I'm struggling to get the school to take my concerns seriously. They're telling me that, you know, I will get support, that it's nothing to do with a diagnosis, it's all needs-based. but my child is still not getting support, so I want a diagnosis, you know. So, you know, once again, it's a slight postcode lottery, but the picture has improved dramatically in terms of children. It's the adults we really need to be deeply concerned about.
Yeah. So that's what in terms of the adults. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Drew Smith.
Thank you, Convener. If I could return to the issue of employment, I'm interested in, and I suspect the answer will be both here, but the extent to which there is a problem of discrimination from employers and their views about autistic people and employing autistic people, and then also the issues of support that autistic people might need in order to gain employment. So I wonder if you can maybe say a bit more about what the balance of the concerns that you have is around those 2 points. And in terms of discrimination, I mean, thinking about other groups that are discriminated against in the workplace and in the labour market, there is a job that I think for the state to do in terms of promoting positive images of people and showing employers how they would be able to support an autistic person. Do you think that is, again, within that, what the balance is between, you know, the positive images that we have of autistic people in society as a whole, and then targeted within the workplace? So are we doing enough? Or, you know, I suppose if your answer to the first point is actually it's more about the support for autistic people rather than it's about employers. Just some kind of sense of where you think the priorities are within that.
I think each one of the points you make is actually an area of potential priority. In speaking to people, what comes back loud and clear is that people have no confidence in society as a whole in terms of them understanding autism. You know, people are still experiencing bullying, discrimination, and in the opinion of people with autism, it's because society as a whole simply does not understand the condition well enough. I mean, as organisations, that's part of our raison d'être, to make sure that we, you know, that we get that information out there. But you know, we're only small organisations, and what is really needed, in my opinion, is some form of, you know, some form of national awareness or national information campaign in order to address this imbalance in society at large. You know, we really want people in supermarkets, the people you meet in the pub, people you meet at your leisure centre. We want them to be able to understand autism so that so that you know, it minimises the problems and people can access the same kind of types of social and leisure opportunities, for example, that we all take for granted. In terms of employment, the reality of it is that particularly for want of a better expression, the more able people with autism, people with a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, for example, you usually find the types of modifications needed in the workforce end up being minimal. You know, it's not rocket science. It's not huge. It's not a huge imposition on employers. It's just knowing what autism is and just making common sense modifications, small incremental changes in the workplace. And we find through doing that people with autism not only fit in well in the workplace, but excel. Where it all falls down is, once again, to come to this, a third point that you made is employers' perceptions. You know, and once again, I think this is just due to this general lack of clarity in the general population about what autism really is. You know, we often feel that many employers think, oh, well, you know, it's going to be a huge burden to me economically, it's going to turn my workplace upside down, I'm going to have to do this, that and the other, you know. But as I say, it all goes back to this thing, you know, it ends up being very, very small modifications. And as I say, you know, as Richard alluded to earlier, employers really don't understand the benefits of employing people with autism, you know, that they can be the ideal employees, you know, they're diligent, focused, fantastic attention to detail. They don't tend to get bogged down in office politics or backstabbing. They don't waste time and they don't gossip, and they get on with the job and they pride themselves in doing a fantastic job. These are all the qualities that everyone would want in an employee. But it's getting the message out there, and that's what we try and do, but at times it's an uphill struggle. You know, but gradually we're getting there. As I mentioned, the graduate programme that we run is turning out to be a fantastic success. We're placing graduates within blue chip companies, and demand is far outstripping supply. So it's not an insolvable problem, but really it's a twofold problem. It's about society at large and their perceptions on autism, and then on a sub-level, the perceptions of employers. And we could really do something about that quite easily, I think, you know.
I think what we want to do is encourage the concept of employment in its widest context. It's not necessarily just about working with employers for them to take on more people with autism. It's looking at employment as wide as possible. It's quite good that the Development Fund projects that link to employment do cover quite a wide range of activities, right from if you like, one end of the spectrum where there's a project that is around supported self-employment, through to other projects that are about prospects of funding and things like that, are about supporting people into existing employment. There's also initiatives that are around which is about creating employment opportunities where somebody isn't, certainly in the short term, going to fit into the workplace. So it's about creating workplaces around the skills and potential of each individual. So having that wide range of employment solutions is what we would argue for, and is being picked up, I think, in the pockets by the Development Fund.
So I mean, I think in summary, really, what we're both saying is well, we're both saying greater awareness is needed, but principally there needs to be more of a focus on employment within the current strategy as it stands.
That's very helpful. I also wanted to maybe just come back to the issue of parents. I mean, I think there's a fairly broad understanding of all the challenges that parents face in terms of issues of diagnosis and raising concerns, and we refer to parents of autistic children as you know, as having to fight for the services that their children need. And there's a hope that we've started to address some of that, and we're beginning. I think you're saying that we're beginning to see that improving. But I suppose for then the parents of adults who are exactly the same people who have had to fight for these things in earlier life, and are now in the situation where they're trying to support an adult, and it may be that them as an older person giving that support, or a sibling giving that support to someone who's not able to find employment, or has challenges around employment. Are there specific issues and things that we could do more to help that group of people in families affected by autism and those around people with autism?
I think I don't want to pour cold water on these things, but there is an element that there's a large number of very able young neurotypical people unemployed, and under those circumstances it's going to be quite difficult. You can't just create jobs. So I agree that there has to be a great deal more education in the workplace, and the relatively simple things like predictable hours, not having people exposed to random telephone calls that throw them off their stride. It's quite simple things. You can actually get people to do it. But in the cold light of day, why would someone take on those risks when they've got 100 other people that they don't have to take that on? And that's a severe challenge. And I do believe that the answer to it, and it is a bit utopian, is to drive down unemployment generally, and then you'll drive down unemployment among people with autism.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, a few short years ago we were in a period of boom, and we're now in a period of austerity, and yet the numbers of people with autism who are unemployed are identical during those two time periods. So it doesn't really matter whether there's all the jobs in the world out there, or whether employment prospects are bleak. Somehow or other, we still end up with this figure of 85% of people with autism are unemployed.
I disagree, because it doesn't matter if there are 5 people ahead of you in the queue or 1 million people ahead of you in the queue, there are still people ahead of you in the queue. And because of the additional problems employers face and the difficulties nowadays, you have to look in the future as a major employer. If you have somebody who does not fit with your working strategy, it's very difficult to get rid of people. You've got tribunals going all over the place. An employer, and I'm speaking realistically here, an employer is faced with the prospect of having someone with any form of a disablement. Getting rid of them if you don't want to keep them is near impossible. Now, these are the real things in the real world. I don't think it's discrimination against people with autism so much as just saying, why, as an employer, with all the other troubles you have, would you take on this additional risk?
Well, but once again, I think that goes back to what I've said, that I firmly believe that huge numbers of people with autism make the ideal employee due to the characteristics that I've already outlined. So I think it's not down to unemployability. It's principally down to employer perceptions. If they knew, then they would tap into this resource. And in a wider sense, in terms of your question, what can be done for adults who are living with ageing parents, it's not just about employment. Employment would make a tremendous difference to these people's lives. It's not just about that. It's about these adults not being prisoners in their own home and never going out over the front door. It's about these adults not being absolutely dependent financially and emotionally and physically on their parents. It's about these adults being in a situation where the only friend they have in the world is their parents. So it's bigger than employment. It's about putting initiatives in place that ensure that adults can have the confidence to go out and actually access leisure opportunities, to pursue their hobbies, to meet people and form circles of friends, and a whole range of things, that basically make up an ordinary life, such as we all lead. And this is what's been ignored, so it's much bigger than employment. It's really life itself, I would say.
Yeah. I agree with what you've just said, Robert. I work with an organisation called PASDA, which is a group of parents of adults with autism in around the Lothians, and their big concerns are, is what we've been talking about, it is employment, it's also housing, but it is about avoiding the crisis, planning ahead. It's about transition again, but transition at a later stage in life, transition into life beyond the family home.
Can I just go back to one of the things I mentioned earlier, this microsegmentation project? Part of that is looking at different domains of quality of life. And I mean, obviously, the huge range of people in the spectrum between people who require 24/7 care and the sort of able people that Robert's describing who could easily hold down a technical job. There are different domains of quality of life for people in different segments. And what we need to look at is the overall balance of, as he says, about leisure, participation, inclusion in society and all the other things. There is no single measure. But the more we understand about the different segments, the better we can approximate our understanding of what is required. And again, I would sing the praises of this document because it's put in place that strategic work to understand that.
Again, one final thing, convener, and I suppose that's on, sticking on the issue of employment, but it's around the career guidance that is available to autistic people leaving school and thinking about going to college or whatever the is appropriate for that individual. Is there a sense that is changing? Because certainly my own experience of thinking of autistic people that I know and people in my family is, has in the past been a bit of a sense of, someone will tell you the sort of thing that you can do, and quite often that's based on some fairly settled views about all the things that you can't, and whether or not the choice is genuinely the individual's. Has there been change in that area, and is there more that we could do, and how does the strategy deal with that?
Funnily enough, I was talking to a careers guidance professional about 6 months ago there, and he was explaining to me that quite some time ago, sort of specialist career, for want of a better expression, tailored specialist career guidance in schools has gradually been eroded away, and it's more a generic approach that is in place at this moment in time. And really, I just knew the way he was describing it to me that it's doing young people with autism no good whatsoever. I mean, it might surprise you if I say that often with young people with autism, it's a question of self-knowledge and having a realistic grasp on what is possible and what is not possible. Quite often you'll find people with autism, they would open up the Glasgow Herald recruitment page and, they would say, I can do every job here, and then you'll have other people who say, I couldn't possibly do any of those jobs. So unlike you or I, where you would know your skill set and know yourself and be able to actually tailor your job search in a realistic manner. Quite often there is no self-knowledge, no self-awareness, no understanding of their own skills, their abilities, their strengths, their weaknesses, and therefore absolutely unrealistic or totally pessimistic perceptions of their prospects for the future. So these things can be tackled, but it's certainly not going to be tackled by a quick generic chat with someone in a room in a school. You know, it requires just a little bit extra effort in order to make sure that people get set in the right path.
Yeah. It's also about sometimes the lack of options for people appropriate options for people to move on to. I know that kind of the funding situation that many of the Scotland's colleges face have meant that a number of, not the courses for people with any kind of disability, but a lot of part-time distance learning, those are the courses that have been cut. And actually, however, they are often the courses that people with autism or people with learning disabilities would have accessed. So there has been an impact for people with autism there.
I pick up on that one because I've a personal interest in that with the further education and the role my local college plays in supporting, in the broadest sense, vulnerable adults, which I'm confident will include some of the people you represent. And I'm very concerned about not the focus on young people at 16 to 24, whether they're focused on that and the employability outcomes. The cutback in courses that you have described, and indeed some discussions with local colleges as they're coming together are actually analysing now, doing a head count of the number of people who come under that vulnerable category. So that's anecdotal, but some of them have been going and attending college for 20 years. And so the transitional thing, that's, I'm very concerned, and I wonder if you have raised any of these concerns in terms of, and you could inform us about what concerns you have raised, because after the formal education system isn't, as I'm aware, that right to those people for further education, it's become a support for those people and the families in terms of somewhere to go every day, not necessarily getting the outcomes. Some of the people have been almost institutionalised in the college system for 20 years, and I'm concerned from a constituency basis that what's going to happen if that squeeze comes on to them and they're pushed back out into the community. Now, I can accept the colleges are saying, well, it's not this is not what the college is for, but how do we manage that transition? Have you raised that with them?
Yes, and I think we're all aware of examples of exactly that kind of situation, and with the kind of historical, the kind of reduction in the traditional day service type facility, many people have ended up in college for years and years. Yes, the reference group's subgroup on employment does include representative from Scotland's colleges who was reflecting back only at our last meeting about how, in a way, well, my take on it, in a way that the colleges were kind of returning to their original focus, which was on specific skills, specific development of areas of skill, and a number of courses being cut that people who perhaps shouldn't have been there, but were there because there were no other alternatives. So, yeah, we're within that situation again where there are no alternatives for some people.
I think, again, looking at the biggest picture, part of what we're trying to do with the 10-year goals is to stop people, if you like, being chucked over the wall into someone else's budget. So the state needs to look at the individual and all the aspects of it, and getting someone out of mental health care perhaps by warehousing them in a college is wasteful for Scotland PLC. And those are, again, the longer term goals and part of the sort of thing that Professor Mackay is looking at in his lifetime trajectories. But there are, we could all give you examples of service users in our organisations who have been passed between different organs of the state. You get particularly health and social care. So I think this is being addressed by this administration, and it's an extremely difficult problem.
Do we know how many people we're talking about at this stage. I mean, I'm aware of the longer term objectives of the strategy, but you know, given that there have been radical changes taking place in that sector, do we expect, you know, I'm just worried that they're getting pushed out and they can't wait on the strategy. What's going to...
I keep coming back to this project, which is to map the populations understand. Robert used the word 20,000. We don't really know how many adults there are out there who would benefit from support. We really need to get a grip on actually understanding the comorbid conditions, the populations within those, and the effect of this on the state. There are many other examples. There are people in jail.
Why don't you know the people who have been supported in the colleges?
Only a very small number of people with autism have actually presented with an issue to the state.
Just interested in
understanding the whole picture. What's been done in the past is local authorities have conducted surveys in their own areas. National Health Service authorities have conducted studies to do with, say, schizophrenia or whatever in their own area. There has never been the big snapshot of the whole thing and an attempt to stitch these together, which is why we needed Martin Knapp and the London School of Economics to do the complex statistical analysis that's required. I have great hopes for this. I mean, we're not going to, the way I like to put it is, you're not going to have a GPS map of Scotland, but we're going to have an idea that Australia is there. And it's that level of understanding that there are knots of population, there are clumps of different conditions. It's not a homogeneous spectrum. The money can be better targeted if we understand the people who tend to be the higher functioning people who could be actually transitioned into employment or get them out of the health service. It's actually understanding the whole needs of that individual that's the key to this.
But not back to Dr. Moffat's scenario. It's all very well identifying and diagnosing. When you have all of that information, it doesn't solve the college budget problem or the local government budget problem.
I do believe
and it doesn't necessarily equal action.
I do believe that the reason we started this programme is that it is vastly more expensive to have someone in prison or in mental health care than it is to have them in the community. So there are actually subsets of population that this will act. If you identify the real major costs, and it is at this higher functioning end of the spectrum, it would actually make an economic case for doing it properly, not a social case.
I think that perhaps it's quite a difficult question you've asked for a variety of reasons, one of them being the unknown numbers, but I was just reflecting on your question. I was thinking that I mean, potentially one explanation might be that there's simply a lack of appropriate courses there, for starters. There's also the issue that I raised about the lack of guidance on leaving school and going in and making these choices. Which course will I go and do and where will that lead me? I think there's the issue of the well-understood issue that people with autism find it incredibly difficult to understand their own condition and to self-advocate for what they want. So there's a need perhaps for some form of advocacy that goes beyond careers guidance. Going back to the kind of lack of courses, you'd be talking about, in an ideal world, having a range of courses that would suit young people with autism, all the way from basic life skills through to vocational studies, to apprenticeships, to diploma-type level qualifications and on to degrees. So you would have a whole range with most of those types of courses actually existing in college. But I mean, that would be in an ideal world. So I think maybe, I don't know whether I'm answering the question or not, but it's to do with all the factors that I've just sort of mentioned that's causing a problem. It's not just about college budgets, perhaps.
No, I think it has to do with college budget because the people that they are set into to attract have got to have good employment outcomes. People that you represent won't have, and as a consequence, I am concerned that they become less a priority. It's about employability of the strategy, and you don't fit that model. But it's a constituency issue, and while we're connecting some of this work up in this session. Again, last week's session was good because it did fit one-off session on stress and trauma fits in with some of the other issues that we are dealing with as a committee, from health equalities, self-directed support, the integration of health and social care. And I was particularly interested, Mr. Somerville, in your opening remarks, and we made strong recommendations in regard to older care, and I think it applies to any care that's being provided by a local authority normally. It's this whole question of the procurement process, the low wages, enforcing driving wages down in carers, and indeed the training of the new workforce that we're going to need to deliver a personalised service of care. So what representations have you made in regards to that issue and
the driving down of costs?
Yes.
Well, funnily enough, I wrote to the Minister about it about 2 weeks ago. We have a particular example at the moment where our largest local authority customer has set a maximum rate. Now, the principle of procurement is 70% of it is based on quality and 30% on price. But if you set a maximum rate which eliminates the quality providers, that rather subverts the system. And I see it happening all over the place. We have major problems. And as I say, what could happen at the end of the day is a dumbing down of specialist service till they're no better than generic, basic physiological care. And the assets and the knowledge of autism-specific providers and other specific providers will be lost. It's a critical situation.
I was talking to a colleague yesterday, so in preparation for this, and she was basically saying to me that a number of local, she works with a wide range of local authorities, and a number of those local authorities, it chimes exactly with what Alan was saying. The specific example she gave me was that quite often people who require support packages require some form of short-term intervention in terms of, for example, psychological services or speech and language therapy. But local authorities with an eye on the finances are simply making the claim that this is some kind of gold-plated service and they will not pay for these short-term interventions. Now, in our opinion, these short-term interventions are absolutely crucial to the successful outcome of the support package. They're not gold-plated add-ons. You're setting yourself up for failure if you don't recognise that these types of supports are actually necessary. So we're under pressure this way all the time with people, and once again, in a way, it relates back to this lack of understanding of autism and how you actually tackle the problem.
Because ultimately, you may have a short-term sticking plaster on the immediate symptoms of the individual, but I am told that there are large numbers of people in this country who are probably diagnosed with schizophrenia, but the autism, which is at the root of it, is never addressed. So the immediate symptoms of the individual are looked at, but not the cause. And ultimately, as I've been saying, another good example is the high representation of people on the spectrum in the prison population. It's enormously higher than in the general population. That indicates to me certainly that something's badly wrong. Now, if people there's no controlling mind. Controlling is a difficult word, but if there's no one actually analysing the trajectories of individuals, you do end up in a situation where they have life crises, you have failures, which are ultimately much more expensive for the state to address than if it was done right first time. And that's the critical argument. We've worked hard at trying to get those principles into the strategy. You can't change it overnight. And going back to Robert's first remarks, I think we've made a good start, but it's too early to tell whether we're actually going to win or not.
I think that the message that we all try and put forward on a regular basis is providing the right support at the right time for certain individuals has significant long-term impact. But that's a message that's very hard to get over.
There's also, I've been working for Scottish Autism for 4 years now, and I came from a completely different background. I looked at the way that service users found their way into our service, and the market has had its effect. That my service users tend to be at the more disabled end of the spectrum, and that's because we're more expensive. And we're more expensive because we have a higher degree of expertise than a lot of other people in those specific areas. And we have to invest in knowledge management, in training, in conferences, and a number of other things which are more expensive than if you just have basic people working. Now, there's another effect there that we tend to find that autism is lumped in commissioning, autism is lumped in with a lot of other disabilities. So autism might be only 10% of the total package when a number of people are tendered for services. So, because we don't do the 90, we don't win the tender. But what happens is these complex individuals go into inappropriate services, it fails, their life goes to hell in a basket, and then it comes back round, and we tend to get business and new service users through a retendering process where it's failed. Now that's really bad, not apart from the fact that it's inefficient from our health services. For those individuals, it's hell on earth, because they've had 2 or 3 years of family disruption, great distress often in many cases, before they find what they really need. And this is, again, going back to what Robert said, there is a general lack of understanding of autism and its complexities out there.
I apologise for the witnesses for my temporary absence. We have Malawi visitors, and I was doing something with our Malawi colleagues briefly. Really, two issues I wanted to raise briefly. One was the question under recommendation 19, 20 and 17 in the report, and that is, the first one was about the development of a signed guideline and guidance. Do we have that now?
Us work in that area, I'm sorry.
So we don't know we've got a signed guideline?
Well, there is a signed guideline. There's been
signed guidelines for children, and the one for adults, it was felt this was not the right time to move forward on that. I might have got that completely wrong, though.
So that's a work in progress, and presumably the development of training materials, which is 17 and 20, where are we with development of training? Because I think if you take what my next question is going to be about, the prison service, unless we have a system which actually identifies individuals going in and therefore can actually try and prevent them coming back in later, or even pick them up earlier in the justice system, then we're going to have real problems. And I certainly find quite a lot of my caseload is related to individuals who've fallen foul of the justice system, because basically there's a lack of understanding amongst both police officers, prosecutorial staff, and indeed the courts. There is a lack of understanding at all those levels of actually what autism is about and what the consequence of someone having autism may be, particularly those with Asperger's, the Asperger's end of the syndrome may have. So I just wonder what we're doing in that area. Just, if the witnesses could give us some information. And just to add to that, I've been working with the Epilepsy Society and an ex-MSP, Gordon Jackson. We've done a lot of work in relation to epilepsy and both the prosecutorial system and defense lawyers system to get them to understand better what can sometimes be the consequences in epilepsy of post-ictal states, etc. So, by getting people to really understand this is making a big difference to that particular area, and I just wonder what's happening in this field. Because as Alan Somerville said, it's very expensive to get someone inappropriately into prison. And frankly, once they're in that system, they rotate around inside that system instead of...
Well, certainly, limited correspondence I've had with prison psychologists and psychiatrists suggests, and this is just my very limited experience of it, is that they regard the individuals as prisoners first and people second. And there is little real attempt to generate, I believe, what they call a prosthetic environment to reform them or to offer them a different way. I think there are again, without wanting to sound stereotyping. There are aspects of a number of people with autism which lends themselves to getting into trouble. A willingness to comply with suggestions, perhaps from people who don't have their best interests at heart. A lack of social understanding of the context in which they're being asked to do something. A tendency to overreact when they become upset in certain circumstances. Now, those are stereotypes, and I don't want to imply that high-functioning people are all like that, but there are a significant number who are. And you can't imagine, I mean, the other one which has often been said to me is a policeman comes up to you and says, "What are you doing, son?" You say, "Well, I'm leaning on this lamppost." Now, that's natural to someone with autism to say, to speak literally about what they're doing, but that's a good recipe for getting a cuff around the ear and chucked in the back of the van. So those are there are aspects of people's autism which lend themselves to getting into difficulty. As I said earlier, all three of our organisations have worked with police forces to try and generate materials to an autism alert card would say, "I have an autism spectrum disorder, I may not respond to your questions in the way you expect," etc. There is a lot of training going on. To give Glasgow a good plug, Strathclyde have produced, Strathclyde Police in conjunction with the City Council have produced an excellent video, I thought, really about showing how people can react in these circumstances. In a library, someone looking in a window of someone who happened to have a bird in the window. All these things are, I mean, that's a very powerful tool. I learned a lot from that video, and I think showing that sort of thing around, broken record, you've always got to do a lot more. There was a conference at Tullyallen and talking to a lot of senior police officers. You're often dealing with young officers who are in a potentially violent and dangerous situation. Do we really expect them to be psychiatrists as well, thinking about this individual? It's very difficult. But awareness, and I think the place, I know a colleague, my opposite number in the West Midlands Autism Society, he has a project going on with custody sergeants, and that looks very good, because that's the point where, you've got a reasonably senior officer, he's sitting there, he's looking at these people, he's thinking, wait a minute, there's something different here. And if you can have the intervention at that point and understanding of someone who's well trained and aware, you can make a big difference. But it's so early days.
I would like to add that, like employment, criminal justice appears to me to be a significant gap within the strategy that really needs to be rethought, perhaps a refocus on it. Our organisations, who are after all voluntary organisations, over the last few years we've worked very hard in terms of liaising with police forces throughout the country, producing, as Alan says, alert cards, producing training DVDs, going in and actually providing training for police officers. We very much hope that come the unified force that we'll be able to actually, in one fell swoop, roll that sort of thing out across the country. We are looking to promote this idea that new probationers coming through Tullyallen receive some form of autism awareness training. The issue of my organisation, National Statistics Scotland, has also done some work with the Procurators Fiscal in the Glasgow area and Dumfries and Galloway area. But as I say, we're small organisations, there's a limit to what we can do, and so we have been active in those fields. I think one of the things that concerns me is that there seems to be a scepticism about the numbers of people with autism, possibly undiagnosed, who actually populate our prisons. There's been a number of studies done, not many, a handful you would call it, and the results have been basically all over the place. You had one study saying there's practically no people with autism in prisons. You've had one study saying that you've got twice as many, 2% of the prison population, which is still 2%, but it's still twice what you would expect. I would cite the informal study done by a health professional working in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, who went into Barlinnie and did a fairly robust but informal study on the prison population within the main prison and the high dependency unit. And she found that using a diagnostic measure, so in other words, interviewing prisoners with this diagnostic tool, and looking for the conclusion that if this person sought a diagnosis in the outside world, would they get it or not? The answers came back as 7% within the main prison population and 14% within the high dependency unit. The drawback is it was an informal study, so there is no consensus as to what the actual true story is in terms of prison, but anecdotally, you know, and just intuitively, you would expect there to be a considerable number of people, much higher than the general baseline population, trapped within prison. So what do we do about it? Well, it needs to be a big focus within the strategy. That's what I would say. Like employment, it is an area that we need to go back and revisit and maybe think again about it. It's a highly complex problem, as you've alluded to, but get it back into the strategy and focus our attention on it.
Get the example from West Midlands custody, and maybe some further comments on your work with prosecutors. But it's also defence lawyers, because if they understand, then they don't get their clients to plead guilty just automatically if they understand there's a problem there. So I think there's a lot we could do there.
In the last 5 minutes, I think, Bob, you want to ask some final questions, please?
I'll try and be brief, because I know time is pressing. You've answered some of the questions I want to ask about the prison population who are living with autism, and I suppose the answer is that we don't actually know, because the studies are all fairly small scale and piecemeal, so it's not all anecdotal, but it's leading towards the anecdotal. But I find it an interesting issue for me would be about how we systematically assess the needs of people in prison, irrespective of whether they have autism or not, in terms of how we support them on exit, which goes wider than an autism strategy, I suppose, but that's helpful in terms of those figures. In terms of the 85% unemployment figure that was raised, I'm just wondering if we're predicting there are, by modelling what, there's 40,000 adults anticipated to have autism within Scotland, but only 2,000 are diagnosed. Are we effectively talking about 85% of the 2,000 are unemployed? Is that where that 85% comes from?
85% comes from a campaign and research report that we produced a couple of years ago, where we gathered data through a variety of sources. So I would have to hold my hands up and say it is not an absolutely concrete, definitive statistic, but that is certainly the stats that came back from the thousands of people that we spoke to.
The reason for asking it was I'm just wondering if 2,000 adults are diagnosed, we know who those people are, we can capture that information, and therefore I suspect that the 85% may presuppose be based on that 2,000 cohort, and I'm just wondering if the other 38,000 predicted to be out there may have more mild forms of autism, and therefore I'm just wondering about that 85% figure. But I accept that you have to diagnose the condition more before you can capture it, but I just had some caution over that 85% figure, but I've no doubt it will be particularly high irrespective of what the figure is.
Not 85% of the 40,000, definitely not.
No. Yes, I think that's worth. Just because the clock is ticking, what I'd written down in relation to employment was, I'm just wondering in terms of incentives there are for employers to take on people with a variety of barriers to employment, of which autism may be one. What incentives are out there? How procurement is, even just put some of this on the record, even if we can't get into details on it, how procurement can be used within the public sector in terms of giving added value to people with additional barriers to employment to be part of the skill set that will be the workforce for that contract. The Scottish Government has got 25,000 apprenticeships every year, and I convene the racial equality cross-party group. When we asked the question how many people were from non-white European backgrounds, if you like, in relation to that, we found out there was not very many, and now they're doing a drive towards making that more representative. And the convener's just suggested to me in terms of how a lot of this will be supported. Do the DWP provide any support in relation to this matter as well? We've got 2 minutes left. I must apologise, but just in terms of getting some of this on the record, about incentivising employers using public procurement, apprenticeships, DWP, even just sitting it on the record for when we return to this at a later date.
Yeah, could I just try and quickly rattle through that then? My opinion is that basically we need to set the bar high. If there's 25,000 apprenticeships up for grabs, then 250 of them should be given to young people with autism, pure and simple. I think that national government and local government, health, should take a lead on this and have positive discrimination, or at least have a willingness to actually recognise what I said earlier, that people with autism can often make the ideal employees, and actually take a lead on this and show some leadership in terms of actively employing people with autism. In terms of the DWP, we believe that the initiatives and programmes that are currently in place and overseen by DWP are failing people with autism, and are really not fit for purpose in terms of actually supporting people with autism effectively into the workforce.
So stop summary there,
well,
but I'm sure we will return.
We do now. We're just on this last second. I found it a very interesting session. Thanks to Mark for suggesting it for the work programme. I think it does fit in with lots and bits and pieces of the work that the committee is doing. Can I express the committee's appreciation for your attendance and the evidence you've provided this morning, and hope that if you have any other comments in and about the employability strategies, then please let us know for completing this. Thank you very much for your attendance this morning.
Yeah, thank you.